Hello, I'm Carl Stabe, and today I have Priya Nalkur. Did I say that right?
Perfect.
All right. You're the founder of the RoundTable Institute. You help leaders maximize their potential, and you're the author of Stumbling Towards Inclusion. We've already talked briefly before we hopped on today, and I'm so excited to talk with you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I think we have a lot in common and a lot to peel back the layers on.
Yes, yes. And that's what this is all about, right? Leaders need to understand what they're really trying to do and how they're trying to do it, and then what frameworks are being used. So let's start with, as a kid, you've probably realized that you've had certain tendencies, certain excitements that kind of stir up inside of you from a leadership perspective, but also from just a work perspective. Can you share a little bit about, how when you were a kid and how these ideas started to really form? Because I like to paint that picture of, this doesn't usually just come from like, oh yeah, I'm going to be, this inclusion expert. There's usually a lot of stuff that happens, years and years back.
Yeah, of course, in retrospect, you can look back at your life and say, oh, yeah, all these things make sense to have gotten me to this point. So we probably project a lot of narrative onto what happened in our lives and make sense of it so that where we are today feels congruent with the story of our life. But yeah, I grew up in Canada in a very homogeneous environment. My parents were Indian immigrants, first generation. We were growing up in a very white context. We were navigating what it was like to be different, to have different cultures, and to have a very different culture than what was the norm at the time growing up in the early 80s. And so a lot of my formative experiences defined me as different and defined me as being, kind of excluded from the norm. So, and trying to like work myself back in so that I could belong. But no matter what environment I was in, I was always different. I was always brown. I was always timid. I was always shy. I was, all these things that many of us, regardless of the diversity of the communities we grew up in, have that experience of being different. But for me, it was so stark because I really was the only person of color ever growing up. Like I tell this story in my book about, and I didn't really even know I was different until someone else pointed it out to me. And we were taking a class picture, and the little boy beside me said, "You can't be in this class picture. You'll ruin it. You're brown. All of us are white." So I was like, "Oh, you're right." So I kind of stepped aside, and it took someone like my kindergarten teacher to invite me back in, and say, no, no, like we all get to sit together and teach him sort of that we're better together. And I think probably the roots of the work I do today come from experiences like that, where somebody went out of their way to include me, invite me, welcome me back in. And I thought, gosh, that felt good. I didn't necessarily feel bad when that little boy did that to me, but it felt good to be included back in. And so, kind of incidentally created my career accordingly to stories like that throughout my life that made me feel included.
Yeah, that's sweet. And I think teachers are so wonderful because they have to catch that, as a kid, you don't always realize what comes out of your mouth and how it affects other people. And it's that adult that needs to say, hey, wait, like we are better together. I'm curious about if someone studied you, like maybe as a teenager, and notice something about you, what superpower that you had, something that really helped you stand out, um, from a mindset perspective, from a skills perspective. What do you think if someone studied you and kind of reported on you? What do you think they would say?
That's a great question, Carl. I hadn't thought about that, but I think I could think about this and come up with all kinds of answers. But the first one that's coming to mind is that I was persistent. And I didn't take no for an answer. And from a very early age, I just, I wanted things my way, and things didn't often go my way, so I had to adjust, but I persisted. So that's one thing. And then I think the second thing that everyone who's known me since a kid is I've been very decisive. I'm the type to go into a new restaurant, I see the thing on the menu and I don't even consider other options. Like that's what I'm doing. And I've made a decision. And I'm like that with my career, with my, in all kinds of my relationships and in my day to day. I make a decision and I move forward. And I don't, I sometimes consider alternates, but once I've made the decision, I don't go backwards and regret it or think, what if, and, I could have done this differently.
Let's
But
wait, let's dig there because I think
yeah,
that is a superpower. Because I think I, I think if there's a spectrum of decisiveness and somebody that's wishy-washy, I think I tend towards the more decisiveness, but I'm not a 10. I'm probably like maybe a 6 or 7. So it sounds like you're a little bit higher. What framework do you use that allows you to make that decision and not look back?
so it is a mindset. It's very much a belief that this decision is the best decision. I've got to make it the best decision, right? So sometimes decisions, if you impose a binary onto it, right? That's the framework. It's either a hell yes or it's a hell no. And if it's a hell yes, that means I'm committed, that I'm not going to consider other ways. Once I've made the decision. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't room to learn and grow and develop. I think that's really important. But you work with the decision and make it the best decision.
Yeah, the guy that started CD Baby wrote a book about that. Oh, I forget his name, and it was a blog post, and then he added it inside one of his books. But the idea is, for me, is that what I'm hearing is you check in with yourself, and I think this is what a lot of people don't practice. Is that I like to think of it as head, heart, and gut.
Same.
There's, like you think of it the same way, where the head is very rational, the heart is very okay, like, this is what enjoying or not enjoying about it. And then the gut is like, okay, what's true for me? Um, do you see it that way too? And do you check in with all three, or is it just kind of like a whole body thing?
That's amazing. I don't do that consciously anymore. But I think at one time when I was developing this understanding of myself, other people tell you who you are before you know who you are. And people would tell me, especially my dad, you're really decisive. That's a good thing, kind of thing. Um, when I started to reflect on where that came from, it was like congruence between my head, heart, and gut. And then it just became a habit. I don't think I really stopped to think about that anymore. But I will say this, as much of it is a strength, it's also, like any strength, can be overused and quickly become a liability, right? There have been times when I have been so decisive at the expense of myself that I haven't considered other ways of doing things that have, you know, potentially cost me effort, time, money, relationships, because I could have done it a better way.
Like investing in Bitcoin before it took off.
That was not a decision I made, thankfully.
I love that. And I think this brings up a good point, because the people who are listening, there is a spectrum of, wishy-washy versus decisiveness. And I think, what you're saying is sometimes that decisiveness, takes grip, and it kind of you set that, okay, that goal or that decision, and you run with it, but you didn't take that time. So let's turn it on its head. Then how do you slow down? And the people who are listening, how do you slow down? And what framework do you use to slow down? So you're like, well, let me consider these options before I just jump at the first thing I see at the menu.
Yeah, I don't slow down. I don't think I can. It's another thing I've learned about myself. and I get injured when I run too fast. That's the metaphor for work sometimes. But what I do is I surround myself with people who have a very different way of making decisions. And I check in with them and I trust them and I really want to learn from them the same way they want to learn from me. And together, I think if we can create a really productive dialogue and be collaborative in the way that we work together, I can be better informed about the decisions I make.
Okay. So you check in with other people, you check in with people that you trust, and then that is a quick way for you to kind of, I guess, you know, see if you're heading in the right direction or not. Is that right?
Well, sort of. I would say the framework, if I could just name the underlying framework, it's diversity, right? Like I alone cannot get this right unless I have a diverse range of perspectives around me. So it's important that I have someone who is not as decisive as me, who's sitting there and calculating the different options and alternatives and is looking at that full decision tree, checking in maybe with their heart, head, and gut and looking at the data in a maybe more comprehensive way than I would because I've short circuited to the decision. And together we can collaborate and come to a middle ground, which I think is wiser for both of us.
I love that. And it makes me think of AI, ChatGPT, as a tool for people who might be a little bit too decisive or indecisive, depending, you know, how how they view things and how they tackle things. Do you ever use like ChatGPT to, and then you ask it a question and help you think things
Absolutely.
through?
We're
Mhm.
trying, I went to a workshop a couple of weeks ago on how to use AI in your business. And I learned so much. And I just was like, okay, I'm going to do this. We're going to bring it in and we're going to experiment with. So we took a real experimental approach to using AI. And the two that we use, I mean, we use ChatGPT, of course, but we use Scholar AI a lot, which helps us to back up a lot of our own research with existing literature and data and statistics. And it really quickens the process for us while also providing a much broader range of data from which we can make better conclusions.
Interesting. Okay, so Scholar AI is will help you cross-reference research. Is that that it,
And provide more research, right? So it's goes beyond. So I can put in, hey, I'm looking for data to support this claim and to see what other relevant hypotheses might be associated with this thing that we want to test. Who's done research on this and what data could help me come to a better informed conclusion? And it will share peer-reviewed articles. It will share actual data and statistics that we could then excavate and learn answers to new questions.
I love that. I love that. And I think you're right. We have to be able to use these different tools. And I never heard of Scholar AI. And I think I was like, now I'm like, I want to go check this out because I love research, and I did so much research around gratitude, and it's kind of where I want to go next because I think, as a leader, you really have to work on your mindset. You've got to practice these things. You've got to be able to, if you do want to include other, if you do want to, try things out that, maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable in your business, you have to be willing to do these, harder things. And so, how do you work on your mindset? How do you find ways to appreciate other people and, make sure that they see, that that their work matters?
So how do I work on my mindset? Honestly, I think it's a daily practice. I say practice, not habit. And practice to me is much more of a conscious effort, right? Like I am thinking about my mindset if I'm on a run or if I'm in the pool doing some laps. I'm going to be doing it during a time when I am engaged in something else that's productive and healthy, but that I can focus my energy on thinking about my mindset. And it's not always the same. And by the way, I don't call it a habit because sometimes the habits we're not as conscious about them, right? Like I can go for a run without thinking about it, but I want to pay conscious attention to my mindset. And the way that I think about it is I look at my day. I say, okay, what kinds of relationships do I want to nurture today? What kind of impact or contribution do I want to have today based on the people I'm going to come across today? And I can nurture my mindset accordingly. I think about, okay, what do I want to focus on? I want to focus on making an impact today. So that means I'm going to show up a certain way. And I
Mm.
have to believe that I can make that impact and that I have something important to say or something interesting to say or something important to learn from the people that I come across today. And then, of course, like as we all know, our mindset can't just live in our heads, it has to live in our bodies too. So, as I think about okay, I want to make a difference today, I want to learn today, I know I have something important to say today, that looks a certain way in my body. It's not slumped over, it's not angry in my face, right? It's actually open, ready, willing in my body posture. So to me, those are the ways I think about it. So it's first a cognitive exercise. And then I just kind of like, am I in it? Am I in it? Do I feel it? Okay, now I'm ready to go. So for me, it's a daily practice in the morning, the same way I would, brush my teeth and have a shower. I think about my mindset and I try to encourage my coaching clients and people who come to our workshops to do the same, make it a daily practice.
Interesting. So you're like, you rev the engine to start your day. So when you release, you're heading in that direction. Do you do you then think about the tasks that will allow you to reach those goals?
Not so much.
Okay.
Not so much because I think that sometimes, we don't have a whole lot of control in our lives, but the thing that we do have control over is how we think, how we react, how we speak with others. And all of that kind of comes forward once I have my mindset. So there is a way of thinking about like my mindset leads to my actions, and my actions lead to my results, which is a really easy framework. It's a very linear framework to think about why we should invest in our mindset because it's the first part that leads to action and action leads to results.
Okay. So let's say you've worked on your mindset, you kind of pull back the slingshot of energy towards that area, right? And maybe it's being more grateful, whatever it is.
Yeah.
um, and then they have to make decisions around this, right? And I think this is where being able to understand, like, you've revved up this certain thing, but you can easily fall back in the old habits and be like, well, no, it's about me and I've got to get this thing done. So what do you think people should be paying attention to make sure that they are reaching that higher state, that North Star, versus falling into those habits that aren't helping them as much as they should?
It's so hard. I don't want to for a second pretend that this is easy stuff. It's hard. And it's an investment that we have to make. I tell my kids, my daughter's 12, my son is 10. They're perfect ages to cultivate this habit of, practicing mindset and investing in it every day. And tell them like you can react to what's going on around you or you can set a tone. Who do you want to be? Right? Reacting is, yeah, you're going to experience a range of emotions in any one day. I want you to experience a range of emotions because that's what makes you human. We should be experiencing a full range. But you can also take the lead and determine how things are going to feel for you. If you're not happy about a situation, turn it around. That's up to you. You can change the way that you approach it. You can change the way you make meaning of a situation. You can change what you believe about yourself in that situation. You can change your body to receive it differently.
Mm.
So
So
I
you
think that's one
comes
thing we
back
have to
to
pay control over. Go ahead.
Sorry, finish that thought.
Yeah, sorry. I think I just remember it's like the one thing that we have control over, that we have control over
Mm,
how we think about it, how we make sense of it, and how what we believe about it.
yeah, because we make the meaning out of the situation. Like somebody might see an opportunity where a pessimist might see an obstacle.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so can you give an example of a bad or not so good decision that you've made recently? And then how do you process through that?
Ooh, a bad decision. So it's like I go back to this bias I have for better or for worse, right? That I don't think of the decisions I make as bad. I make them and I go forward with them.
Mhm.
And I get to learn along the way if it wasn't what I anticipated. So I
And that's
make,
what I want. I want you something you didn't anticipate, because we all have those expectations, or we all have a certain idea of how it should play out, but then it doesn't play out. And there's that. For me personally, there's sometimes I crumble, right? And I'm just like, and I just get mad. I'll get mad at myself. I'll get mad at the world. And I've gotten so much better. And I'm just curious how you process through it so you're coming out the other side stronger instead of weaker.
yeah, so I'm going to share a decision that's going to sound like a little one, but it actually had an enormous impact on my life. And it was one of those decisions that, like, throughout the day, we make all kinds of choices and decisions, and we're not even always conscious of them, but they define our day and they define our reality. So, 2 Thursdays ago, I run every day at the same time on the same treadmill at the same pace. So I got on my treadmill and I started running. It was just warming up. And before I knew it, I was 12 feet behind my treadmill, all bruised up and completely, tore a muscle in my shoulder of all things. And the decision I made that day that was that I could not have anticipated led me to that moment was that I didn't put the safety on. And I never put the safety on. It was a decision I probably made very early on when I started running on treadmills. And did I beat myself up over it? Yeah, absolutely. Because I was like, I am someone who needs to understand what happened here. And after going through it and reflecting on it, I realized like it was a fluke. But what I could have done instead was made the decision to put the safety on. That would have saved me so much pain and agony and physical, like, kind of not being able to do the things I love to do. Um,
And wait, the safety, does that automatically stop the treadmill from moving?
yeah, it would have
I
prevented me
don't, I'm not a
from
treadmill guy. Okay.
Yeah, it would have prevented me from flying off 12 feet
Okay.
behind me. I probably would have landed with much less impact and much safer,
Mm,
right? So, um, and this process was like, okay, I'm 45 years old, I'm getting older, I can't take things for granted anymore. I can't take my safety for granted anymore.
mm.
So a little decision becomes, your identity. You're like, oh, okay, I've got to do things differently in my world right now. I've got to pay a little bit more attention to my footing, to my grounding, to how I'm using my body when I didn't have to ever think of that before. So it led to me making a new decision in my life, which is to just be a little bit more aware of my surroundings, take the precautions that are there available for me that I've never had to think about before.
Yeah. I love that example. And I have so many situations like that, with my dogs running around. I'm 47, so I know where you're coming from. But what I've noticed to me is sometimes my anxiety will pick up if I'm working on something like, just say, an in-depth blog post, right? And I put hours and hours, and it's good. It's probably like a B minus, right? It's probably got value in it, but it's not really good. Like, at least I try to at least make it like a B plus, A minus. And sometimes I will hit publish, and I think I've what I've come to realize is I feel I have set this arbitrary deadline for myself, like, okay, I'm going to publish this Sunday, and this is the piece I'm going to do. And instead of just taking that extra day and letting it sit and coming back the next day or even a few hours later to like just reread it and like make sure it makes sense, I'll be like, ah, it's enough, because I've spent hours on it at that point, hours and hours. I, uh, and I'm learning to I'm seeing these patterns, and this is where I want to go next. I'm seeing these patterns, and then but I'm able to do it, because I journal. And I'm curious, do you have a way to see your own patterns, um, and catch them and notice them, um, and then that we can make adjustments quicker?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan. I love that you have a journal. I do too. I've been writing since I was 12 years old in a journal, and I've kept all of them, which I think I'm so glad I did. It turns out to be the biggest gift that I have them all because I can read back and see, like, to your first question, who are you and who have you always been? There are things that have been immutable about who I am. So I do keep a journal. I write regularly, but I also practice what I preach. I am a coach, so I have a coach, not only to help me sharpen my saw and be a better coach, but to also work through how I showed up for my clients and to check that I am not allowing too many of my underlying biases and beliefs bleed into the coaching relationship and make sure that I'm practicing equanimity and in service of my clients. So I see patterns there too. I also have a therapist, and I think, it's really important for us to be able to have someone who we trust, who is very, very, I don't want to say the word neutral, but they're objective. And they can tell you from a place of real compassion, hey, Priya, here's what I'm seeing. What do you think? Maybe I got it wrong, but this is what I'm seeing. And to reflect back to me the things that I'm not able to see because I'm so deeply embedded in my experience, is super, super helpful. And I can take it or leave it. I can grapple with it. I can navigate it. That's really up to me. And I have found much deeper fulfillment from having all three, like triangulating. I'm a coach. I'm kind of a self-reflection junkie, right? So, um, having these structures in place really helps me to amplify the patterns that are, I think, serving me and serving the world, but also dismantle the patterns that are not serving me and the world.
Yeah, I like that because yes, I have a therapist too. Um, and I think you're right. I think it just helps. And I think if you're too caught up in your ego, you end up making decisions that are ego based. And that usually uh, turns out bad for me, at least. And I think when I can kind of pull back a little bit, have someone help me. Um, but I think it's really, cultivating that in your life, right? Because it's easy to see things the way you see things and you say this is the way things should be. Um, but it depends on how you want to show up for others, right? If you're going to be inclusive, if you're going to include people in your life, you have to have their view be a mirror onto your own life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that contribution is it's not all navel gazing, of course. It has to be that you can listen, get into other people's shoes, understand different perspectives, be willing to hear perspectives that are like diametrically opposed to your assumptions. So, I also read a ton.
Mm.
I read upwards of 50 books a year, and I just go through and make sure that the authors I'm reading are diverse, represent very different perspectives, not just that I'm like, practicing my work in an echo chamber of people who feel the
Mm.
same way I do. Um, I had a client years ago, who Asian client, and he said to me on our very first call, he said, all right, Priya, I'm going to level with you. I don't like psychologists and I haven't had good experiences working with women. So I don't think this is going to work out. And I said to him, well, lucky for you, I'm a psychologist and a woman, so let's get to work. Um, And what happened in our process was we were both resisting each other because, like you said, my ego was sort of like, oh gosh, I'm exactly who he doesn't like. But
Mm.
then the very next thought was, well, maybe that's exactly who I need to be for him to see himself and for me to see that I'm much more than those identities he just described to me. So, yeah, diversifying our perspectives through what we consume in literature, through the people we work with in media, I think helps us to break patterns, helps us to stay on that course around our own personal vision for ourselves.
Yeah. I want to kind of go a little bit deeper into the decision making process because I think it's really important to be able to have a process around, let's say if you're hiring a new employee or you're going to take on a new project. I find the people who are really focused on the most important things, know what's essential for their business, for their lives, make the better decisions. And
Mm.
so if you have a complex decision and you're trying to say yes or no to it, and I heard you say hell yes and hell no earlier, how do you make sure you are, you know, really understanding all the sides of it? What's your framework to like, say, okay, this is something that can help me. Um, is there a method to your madness, and what does that look like?
Sometimes there is a method to the madness, right? It's like, okay, what do we as a team understand about this, right? And there could be a lot of things we understand. Then there's like, what do we not understand about this?
Mm.
And can we get closer to understanding it? And even after you go through that, there's going to be a lot of unknown unknowns, right? Like there are things that you're like, I couldn't have possibly known this. The question is then, so like you can look at it outside of yourself. You can have all kinds of post-its on your wall and say, okay, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what we can figure out. And then there's these other things that we can't figure out. And then there's like the mystery piece that we'll find out after we make the decision. But ultimately, I have to ask my team and myself, do we believe in ourselves that if we mess up, we can recover, repair, and keep going? And from that, if we can say yes to that, then we can move forward on the adaptive challenge of that decision with all these unknowns in it. We can impose technical solutions on technical parts of the decision and move forward and learn and experiment on the pieces that we don't know yet, as long as we can say yes. But if there's doubt over whether we're capable, whether we believe, whether we don't believe in ourselves, then we don't move forward on the decision. It is contingent on us believing in ourselves.
Mm. It's a good point, right? You have to, if there's not enough belief, it won't happen because as soon as you hit that roadblock, you're gonna be like, I knew this wasn't gonna work, and then you end up throwing in the white towel.
Well,
Okay.
we do. I mean, I kind of have this belief, and my book is about this, right? That we're going to stumble. We're going to make mistakes. Are we going to be able to recover? Or are we going to like stay on the ground? And if one of you falls, is somebody else on the team going to help you up? And
Mm,
we can only say yes to that before we proceed.
yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So what are you currently struggling with? What is it, and how are you working through it?
So what you said, Carl, about like having the B plus um article, it's a little bit of a struggle for me too, right? It's like
Mm,
no one in my life would ever call me a perfectionist. I'm so far from it. But there's a way in which I like being the A student. I like putting out good stuff. And so I have a little bit of a struggle right now as my book is coming out in April. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is a little scary." Like I wrote it, I think it's good, but I'm struggling with how what it's going to mean for other people. And I
Mm.
don't know that yet. I have to wait and see. I'm prepared for lots of different reactions, and I think it's going to be challenging also to hear what people have to say about it. So that's one thing. I also have the thing about like, is it good enough? Right? Even though I practice the 80-20 rule, I still wonder, am I at 80% before I put this blog post out or share it with people? That's kind of a constant struggle, and it has pros and cons, right? The pro is that I'm not rash in decisions I make. I'm not rash in, I tend to be pretty thoughtful. But the con is that it can cost me some time. It can, I can ruminate the same way you shared,
Mhm.
and not know whether I'm ready to to put it out there.
I find that fascinating. Yes, I would never have thought of myself as a perfectionist, and I think I didn't want to be a perfectionist because my dad was a perfectionist, and I saw what it did to him, and it held him back. So I purposely tried to kind of go the opposite route. But the older I get, the more I notice the tendency to not want to be a perfectionist, but get angry at myself when it doesn't turn
Uh,
out like I hoped it would because I hit send or I hit publish too soon, or I didn't take that time to reread that email to, somebody that I'm trying to connect with. And I will often like, I'm just curious, how did this, the next day, email that I hit sent on, and I'm like, yep, there it is. Like the mistake that I thought might be there. And, but what I'm trying to do is then use that as an opportunity to say,
yes.
okay, I'm noticing these patterns. And, when I feel that bit of like anxiety of like, just send it, fine. You don't want to be a perfectionist. To balance it out and that self-awareness of like checking in
Totally.
these checks and balances. That's why I love frameworks so much because lately what I've been doing is the Pomodoro method. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah. Yeah. I teach that to my clients. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm like, so 25, real quick, it's 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, or 50 and 10, right? Depending on your personality. And so I do 25 on and five off. And that's been helping a lot. And I've known about this for, I don't know, 12 years, 15 years. And I tried to institute it and it didn't work. And now, just over the past, I don't know, 3 months or so, I've been utilizing it. And I'm
Oh,
like, oh,
nice.
it does work. But I didn't have the patience before. And now I have the patience that I'm like, oh, so things are coming full circle. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. Like, and this is what I think is important about keeping a journal or noticing these patterns, because then you can say, well, let's try this again. And it might work the third or
That's
fourth
right.
time.
Well, I love what you're saying because I love frameworks too. And I have taught my clients lots of frameworks. And the more I teach them, the more I realize that there are some things that don't fit into frameworks, right? There is some mystery and there's some magic in being human. And so
Mhm.
it works for you now. It didn't work for you then. Why? Like maybe that was just a mystery, or maybe it was magic, or maybe you were ready for it. Maybe it was luck. So we have to be human and allow for some room, um for things to be ready for us when they're ready for us.
Yeah. And I think this is right. I love that the magic of being human, right? It's sometimes, I struggle with my oldest son because he likes to push back against me. And sometimes I've gotten a lot better. I used to be like, kind of like my dad and shut it down quickly. And last night I fell into the trap, of like shutting him down probably too quickly because I just wasn't in the mood. I just was
Yeah,
like, okay, I can't handle this right now. And maybe that, but I am working on getting more curious. And I think this is where I want to take this next because I think, like with your mindset framework that you use to kind of help slingshot you into your day, how do you, go about, seeing how your brain is working and processing things. So you're building those, and I think coming back to the people and including people, building those connections with people, maybe like my son, or in your case, maybe an employee, or maybe one of your kids, but doing it in a way that allows you to grow with them and learn from them. And, what is that process that you use?
Yeah, I have learned the hard way, that, and it sounds so cliche, but I just believe it, that failure is a gift, that we're gonna make mistakes, and the more ready we are to accept our fallibility, the better we're going to be, right? So it's like, you have a 12, 13-month-old baby who's trying to walk, and they're going to fall every 3 seconds. But they don't stay on the ground. They get up each time and they try something different. And they just kind of know innately, with some encouragement from their parents and the people around them, to keep trying and to keep getting up. And leaders, we all have stumbling blocks. I think that if you're a leader, you have a responsibility to understand what your stumbling blocks are, and once you know them, work to overcome them. Not eliminate them because they're just going to be replaced with another stumbling block. We've done some research on what are the common stumbling blocks that people come across. And there's, for people who want to be more inclusive as leaders, there's really 8 stumbling blocks. And so people can take that assessment to see, okay, which stumbling block tends to stop me from being as inclusive as I can be.
Mm.
So to your point, once you have that curiosity about yourself, you're going to want to learn. Once you know that you're stuck in that pattern, like one of these stumbling blocks we call the rescue ranger. This is the person who just comes in and tries to save people without understanding the underlying causes of injustice or what's going on in the environment. And sometimes they do so with really good intentions, but they end up minimizing the voice of the people who got discriminated against because those people could have stood up for themselves. But it comes with really good intentions, but it turns out to have a unintended negative consequence. So if we know what those stumbling blocks are, then we can work to, with some self-forgiveness and grace, we can work to overcome them, correct them, repair them, and keep moving forward without letting them stop us and punish ourselves with them. So I think it has to start with this belief that we're human, we're going to make mistakes. In fact, we have to make mistakes because that's how we learn and grow.
Mm. I've been listening to uh, uh, Farming Street, Brain Food. I forget his name. I'm terrible with names. But he talks about having a decision journal, and then
Mhm.
what helps is you become more objective, because no decision's perfect. There are going to be consequences to every decision you make. If you decide to have ice cream, and you're gonna, it might put on weight, you might it might upset your stomach, whatever it is. If you go run and you're doing something positive and you twist an ankle or whatever, or you pull a muscle, these things happen, right? And there's consequences to them. And I think and to your point, there isn't really, it's not failure that you went and jogged and you hurt yourself, pulled a muscle. It's just the nature of it. It's not going to say, well, now I should never run again, right? And I think
Yeah,
this
it
is,
happened to teach you something. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I think you're right. I think as leaders, we want to make sure we get things right, but the reality is, there is really no, perfect way to do anything. And the idea then is like, okay, like, let's learn from this together. And I think what that does is shows the team that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to try things. And it's these things that we try. We always talk about small companies being nimble and be able to make pivots quickly, and take new things, take on new things. And I think big companies struggle with this because they have a lot of, people, and it's a larger moving ship. And I think you're almost afraid to make mistakes. You're afraid to try those things because then you can look back towards others. But I think um, from listening to you, if you can cultivate that, hey, let's just review the mistake. Let's not it's not good or bad. Let's look at the positive and negatives of this decision and let's learn from it. And then it's like, oh, yeah, it's not this is a good thing. We're trying these things. We don't know the future and therefore we're going to make these mistakes. And if we cultivate that on our teams, they become much more inclusive, because then it's like every idea is worth considering. You might not take action on all the ideas, of course, but you're listening to them and you're using that as input then to help you make a decision that has many different inputs from all these different people.
Totally, totally. I love that, right? It is a learning journey, and I've learned also in the process, there are certain questions I can ask myself to accelerate the learning, right? So, the first one is, if there's a mistake, the first question is, did I cause harm? Okay, if I hurt someone, the first thing I've got to do is repair that, right? Understand the underlying beliefs that got me to make that mistake so that I don't make the same mistake again and cause harm. That's the first thing. I never want to cause harm, but sometimes our mistakes inadvertently do cause harm. And it's not enough to just apologize, right? You actually have to repair, understand where it came from, and not do it again. Commit to not doing it again.
Mhm.
Once you clean up that harm, and that can take a long time, by the way, like you have fractured relationships, that can take a long time to heal and to repair. But in the similar process, then you can ask yourself, what is the root cause of this mistake? Right? So that might be a belief or something you were focusing on or something you were biased around or something you were assuming that caused the mistake. If you can, once you see the assumption or the bias that caused you to make the mistake, it becomes so clear why it led to that consequence. Having said that, there are times when there is no clear bias or reason or root cause. I don't think that happens too often, but when there is, it's sort of, for me, it's almost agonizing to say it was a fluke, it was chance, it was luck, right?
Mm.
But accepting that is part of the learning process.
Because you don't have control over everything.
Totally, totally. Yep. Hi, you're back.
I guess the wind. Uh, I'm hardwired in, but yeah, I guess it didn't like that. It's still recording. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Okay. Um, do you have time for a couple rapid fire questions?
sure. Yeah.
Okay. What book do you most recommend to others?
The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison.
I never heard of that. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I've learned more about humanity, race, and myself from reading Toni Morrison's fiction than I
Hmm,
have anything else.
interesting. Okay. I gotta check it out. What podcast do you most recommend?
Mm. So I'm a psychologist at heart. I love Where Should We Begin? Esther Perel's
Hmm,
podcast on it's live couples therapy sessions, and she's the therapist, and it's amazing.
that sounds cool. I gotta
Yeah.
write that down. I've never listened to that. And what was your favorite toy as a kid growing up?
So I still have this. I had a I had a puppet, and it's like this wrinkle. I don't know if you remember back in the 80s, there was these brand of dogs called Wrinkles. Everybody wanted them. I finally got one
Mm.
for my 8th birthday and I still have it. It's a puppet. And it was my imaginary friend and we would have conversations every night and I still have it.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I bet every time you think of it, it like zooms you back to when you were 8 years old again.
Yes, totally.
That's
I love that
awesome.
question.
Thank you so much for being here. How can people go to find out more about you?
Thank you. I love this interview, and I love the conversation, your insights. I learned a lot from you. My website is priyanalkur.com. That's where people can take the assessment that I talked about, the inclusivity
Mhm.
readiness report to understand what your stumbling blocks are. You can pre-order my book, and if you don't want to do that, you can just subscribe to our newsletter and get it's monthly and get some insights around inclusive leadership that way.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.